Welcome to the YouMeVerse podcast. We're your hosts, Jeffrey and Odette. Together we have thousands of hours of yoga and meditation experience.
Here, you get to be butterflies on the wall and listen in on our joyous spiritual conversations about how these practices have and continue to transform us. Thank you for joining.
Okay, then we're off.
All right, we are off again, and here we are with episode 4.
Episode 4.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Today, we have already kind of set a little intention, I think, for our conversations. Earlier, we were talking about receiving or meditation, more specifically meditation experience. And Odette was asking me, actually, if you want to go ahead and take it, maybe you want to speak about some of the things that we were talking about, some of the things you were asking me, because I like the format that we've been doing thus far, where you kind of get into the topics, ask specific questions, and then I'm able to kind of bounce those back at you. How do you feel about that?
That sounds great. And I feel like there have been topics that came up in the last 2 podcasts that we haven't fully opened up. Mm-hmm. And specifically, that topic was meditation and your perspective on meditation, because you have a lot of meditation experience. And specifically, you've mentioned meditating and also being in this meditative state where you receive. You've used that word a couple times, like you get into this state and you are receiving, for example, thoughts. Instead of thinking thoughts, they come to you. Or you'll be working with someone. And I would also like more detail about what that has meant for you, like working one-on-one with someone. You'll talk about being in this meditative state, working with someone, and you receive for them. Like you receive, I don't know if it's thoughts or ideas, and you share it with them. So that's where I'd like us to begin this conversation.
Okay. I think I'll just start speaking about those in general, and then you can ask questions. And then I would probably like to ask you maybe how these overlap with experiences you've had. Because, we all have different experiences, even in these practices, no matter what. But then we can find similarities, because I believe we're all doing the same thing. It's just our interpretation of what we're doing differs relative to what we've already experienced. So for me, and I talked about this a little bit earlier before we actually started to record, when I first started to meditate, it was through yoga. I mean, like we all, or not we all, but anyone who has done yoga may have experienced. And you mentioned before, I think it was in 2, about how when you're in those more challenging poses, and I actually just had a conversation yesterday with somebody about this, the only time that they ever really feel like that they're able to be in that clear state of mind is when they are having to focus with such intensity on something physically, because it requires all of their focus. And so when they do that, then they're completely clear, because if they don't focus, they're going to fall, or the pain is so intense, or the sensation, I should say, is so intense that they have to maintain that. Otherwise, they can't do it. So that is similar for me. And that was my foray into getting into that level of focus. And that to me is the genesis for tapping into what it's like to be clear. Then kind of extrapolate that over thousands of hours of practice. And what I've said is that when you do it long enough, you start to get into these subtle places where you feel this expansiveness. And an example might be, if I meditate, say, for an hour, and I haven't, let's just say, maybe I explain this in a way that maybe people that have maybe done a little bit of meditation can relate to. Let's just say if I meditate for an hour, and the first 5 minutes I'm having to clear because there's all this remnant thought that is coming into my experience because of the previous day or the previous week or whatever. So really in that beginning phase, I'm just being mindful. I'm just observing. Why is this coming in? Letting it go. Trying to just get to that state that most people have to focus with something with a lot of intensity, say physically, to do so. So once I get past that phase, then I'm in that clear state. Now I'm in this expansive place. where all I'm doing is now tuning, where I'm feeling the sensations. And this is where we go into that jargon or vernacular of vibration or frequency. Because when you get to that place, then there's never thoughts that are coming in. You're just feeling these states, these vibrations. And then when you are there, you then can associate it with thoughts. But for me, because I've done it so much, it doesn't come as thoughts. It comes as imagery.
Can I ask a question at this point already?
Yeah.
So when you're meditating, and I'm assuming just to like paint a picture that you'd be maybe sitting, be sitting and your eyes might be closed.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we can maybe get into what other specific things you're doing, like maybe breathing in a certain way, but give me an example of like what a frequency might feel like. Like, is there a physical way that meant? So could you give us an example of that?
Yeah. So if I'm sitting in lotus, for example, this is when I feel more so than any other thing that I do, the energy of it. What it feels like as I start getting to these higher states, it's energy that is literally flowing. And then you can even use like some kind of yoga philosophy and even some books I've read talks about these channels through the body where there's these energy channels. And I won't go into the specifics of those because it doesn't matter. I'll just tell you what it feels like. But there are these channels that, and I describe them as like 3 channels. It's like left, right, and center. And I can feel where the energy is kind of moving up and through the body. And when I start getting into those higher states, I can feel that energy moving more rapidly and it's faster. It feels like a frequency because the rate in which it's moving increases. So it feels kind of like the best way to describe it would be, here we go. Kind of like when you get, say, goosebumps on the outer layers of the skin where it kind of tingles a little bit. So it's like that, but within the body. And it's not just stationary, it's moving. Like it's literally moving vertically up and down the body. And it starts going faster and faster.
Have you found that you've been able to control that feeling, or does it just spontaneously move?
Sometimes. I've played with this a lot because when I try to control it, that's where this subtle place that I talk about comes in. If I try to harness it, then I can lose it because then I'm trying too much. It's more about a state of allowing than it is of trying, just like with anything.
My grandfather is a hypnotist, and he doesn't like the word trying. He always says to me, if you're trying, you're lying. Yeah. Like you either do something or you don't. There's no trying.
Yeah.
But okay, I want to come back because for someone who's just beginning to meditate, I don't know if feeling something like that would be, I don't want to use the word too advanced or subtle, but like a goosebump feeling, everyone knows what that feels like. So something sort of like that, and it's deeper inside the body and your mind is more clear so you can feel it. So, right. Are we there at that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I would say to somebody who maybe has never even done meditation, if the practice, and that's why mindfulness had become so popular in recent years, that's really what all they're trying to get people to do in those initial states is just not think. And that can take a period of time. That's a process in itself. That's just like the first stage of it. So how are you learning or practicing not thinking or non-thought? And that can take a long time. So if somebody's listening to this, like, oh, I want to start feeling that, you're not going to likely feel that, in one practice, but it is a practice. And that's the reason. So if you can get past that place of thought, and you don't have to be sitting, I would actually suggest, and I have always suggested, that people don't sit if they've never done it, because it's so challenging physically, that you're so focused on the physicality of it, that you're more focused on that, and you're likely maybe not comfortable, and you're not really going to get into those experiences. I always taught people to lay on the ground on a hard surface. A yoga mat is good, but not on the carpet, not on something super soft, definitely not a bed, but on something that you can feel your body. And this is exactly how I would teach people. And I would say use a blanket, like a Mexican blanket. That's always been my favorite. And lay on a hard wood floor or concrete or whatever, and then breathe into the body and always anchor with breath. Breath is the foundation. And so breathe into the body, very subtle, very slow, in and out through the nose, a little deeper and a little longer with each successive cycle, and just keep that focus on the breath. And then when thoughts come in, just go back to the breath. Go back to the breath. A lot of people will practice or teach with candles or certain types of focus, but breath is the foundation. So if you can use that, then you're going to start feeling the body too. And then you're going to start connecting the body and the breath. And so you're doing yoga by laying on the ground. That's the same thing, but you're also now practicing the non-thought without having to go into these, really difficult or challenging poses to do that.
I love that. I'm writing notes about what you're saying. You're saying so many things. I love like the breath. If you don't, it's not fancy. Like you don't need to have all these fancy props. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you don't need, from what you're saying, to have a candle or a special place or even special music, but
no,
anchoring into your body in the breath. Anyone can do that even right now.
Yes.
Like listening to the podcast, just feeling their breath while they're listening. Which
is why I actually thought about recording a 3-minute intro to each one, just a quick 3-minute breath meditation intro, and then indicating, or at least suggesting, that people use that breath intro throughout the podcast as they listen, and be conscious of that breath as they listen.
We should totally do that for them. And I would be interested in having that too. I'm interested more in this non-thought state. So when you are in this non-thought state, is that when you feel like you are receiving more, if I can come back to that word?
Yeah. So that, like I said, it's like the bridge into that state of being. So that is the first step. There is a linear process to that. Because if you can't get to non-thought, then obviously you're not going to get to anything else. I mean, thoughts, like I've said in the previous episodes, they're just repeating things that you've given attention to. I mean, it's just
right. Like the sky is blue or my feet or anything, just a thought.
Yes, anything. Exactly. And it's just you continuously giving attention to it. And so when you take your attention from any of those things and you can just purely observe and you have your eyes closed and you're just observing within, then you can, this is where all the subtlety is. This is where all the nuance is. And it's so expansive, which is why I always say the deeper you go, the more subtle it becomes, but the more expansive it is. It's so expansive. It's impossible to describe until you've actually experienced it. But then once you get there, and this is what you and I were just talking about earlier. And I've talked about this with other practitioners who've done yoga or meditation for years themselves that have not experienced some of these things. I'm not saying you haven't. I'm just saying because of, thousands of hours in less than a year, I was very much aware every single day how much further into that subtlety I was getting into and what it really meant and what it allowed me to observe and then, really give attention to. And so once I got to these places where I recognized what a state of being is, what a vibration is, what a frequency is, and then associated that with, say, normal human behavior or beingness or experience, I then could disassociate it and recognize how it correlates. And what I mean by that, the example is, if I am in, say, a lower state or a lower vibration, and I get into that state where I am pure, clear of thought, then I witness myself. I want to make a disclaimer. When people talk about vibration and raise your vibration, whatever, it's not something you're doing. It's just something that you're allowing to happen because that's the natural state of being. That's the natural state of being through enlightenment. There's a term, but we resist it through the things we give attention to. It's that simple. If you just stop resistance by stopping those thoughts, you're going to naturally go to those states. But I did it so much and I've observed it so much, I'm aware in very subtlety how that happens. And so as I observe that frequency or vibration or state to increase, I can observe the thoughts that are associated with those levels of being. And so quickly that it's there's that thought associated with that. And I'm feeling it move forward now or move upward now. And there's that thought associated with that. And I just keep going. And that's why when people are first learning mindfulness, they're just taught, well, observe the thought and then let it go, or, whatever the practice may be. But they're just looking at it at that superficial level of, okay, I'm just detaching from these things. But deeper than that, you can actually witness where that state is coming from.
From inside, it sounds like it's coming from inside and what you're doing and focusing on.
And the benefit of that is that when you do that long enough, you can see those thoughts and those patterns in such a way that you know that where that is, like, you know, relative to what state of being that is. So you don't have to think about it in the future. Like, oh, I know that thought, even if it's been a week or a month or whatever, is associated with this state of being. I've known it because I observed it in such clarity. So, if it comes back up at another time, even if it's a year later, you just don't give attention to it in real life as you're moving about because something reminded you of it. That's the true transmutation, because you've already seen it in such a way. So that's kind of like stage 2, I would say, in my experience. But then when you get to, if you want me to go forward, say with how I relate it to other people, because that's kind of what you were talking about too, is like, how are you receiving for other people? Or how are you experiencing what other people are asking for? I can kind of jump to that, or I didn't know if you...
Well, I think I would like to go there. I'd like to maybe get more of a fleshed out example of what you already said, like in step 2. So in step 1, if I could summarize it, it was like quieting your mind and getting to this non-thought place. And then step 2 would be tuning in to these frequencies, or feeling into your body and noticing what thoughts you have and what feelings that are naturally coming up from your state. And I wanted to get another example, like an actual example for that. So could we say that a lower state could be something like sickness?
Yes.
Like feeling sick. I mean, you obviously don't feel like you're flying high. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't be like, yeah, I'm definitely, maybe there's fevers that are high, but I'm not feeling so high. So someone who's in a state, could I call it that? Like a state of illness or a state of sickness? Okay.
And that's actually what I was thinking when you were saying, before you said that too.
Yeah. So, I mean, it feels to me as I'm talking about it, like it could be a tender subject, because I think without meaning to, people sometimes get attached to identities and identities of being sick even, and needing and wanting to have nurturing and support. Right. But it's almost like this sickness builds its own identity inside of them. Yes. But really what you're saying is almost like a way out of that cycle, because you're saying like a lower state, like sickness, it's just a state of being, and there are other ones that could be available.
Yes, in real time.
So someone who's not feeling well, they could go through the same process, right? And it seems very simple.
Instantly.
Like just stop, and as best as they could, lie on the floor on a blanket, quiet their mind as best they could, and then just start feeling into their body. And then what if they feel their sickness? And what if thoughts come up like, well, that's nice that he thinks that, but I have a fever and I'm sick. And like, well, those are just thoughts too, right? Yes. Like, what would you say to, if I said that to you?
Yeah.
Like, what would you help me with?
Oh, there? So perfect. So perfect. I love these questions. Yeah. And here's the thing. So there's 2 ways of going about that. And that is, if you're in a state of illness or disease or sickness, you're behind your state of being that you have evolved to be. And you're in so much resistance that you have now manifested that resistance in a physical way. That's all it is. So now you're asking in a stronger way for clarity on how to heal or to fix or to solve this problem. And yes, a lot of people go to the external places of being and look for answers, such as a doctor or a medication or a surgery or whatever for any of these things. And those will and can work. I'm not saying they don't, depending on where you're at. But it doesn't have to, because you're using those as kind of bridges to believe that they are healing you. And like I said, I'm not saying that those things don't do that. They do, because people believe they do. That's all it really is. But if you're, say, at a not so deep level where it requires surgery or some major intervention, and you just have, say, a fever like you were talking about, then yes, it is absolutely possible. I've done this many times with myself years ago, where something might come up and I go and I sit with it and I breathe into it, and it might take me 15 minutes and it clears up. And people have witnessed me do this, and they're like, I've never seen that. And it wasn't because that's how I began doing these practices. It was because I did that through the stuff we talked about in, say, episode 2 with all these injuries. And so if I could do that with injuries that are beyond description, then of course I can do that with just a little bit of resistance in, say, like a cold or something. But what I would suggest somebody do is if they're in that state, it's going to be a little challenging because they're going to notice it and they're going to lay there and they're going to feel it. However, you can also use that to your benefit. Because if you're then breathing into that and you're feeling what it is, then those experiences that I talked about, like in 2 with myself, are going to happen. You're going to start having thoughts. You're going to start having these things that you are literally transmuting, that you're transforming, come up. But as you sit with it or lay with it or lie with it and you experience it and you breathe through it, then that begins your transmutation journey.
May I jump in? Can I ask and say something? So I like that you said that way. And I'm also thinking about what you said earlier. You said pain. You used the word pain about sitting. Sitting can be uncomfortable and there might be pain, but then you use the word sensation instead of pain. And I feel like that even doing that, having these experiences come up or frequencies or physical sensations, but changing the way that you relate to it. So instead of feeling this thing as pain, just beginning this new relationship with that feeling and saying, okay, this is a sensation. This is a strong sensation. And really just using the way you're looking at things. I feel like can help something shift or help something become less painful if you call it a sensation. I'm not saying for sure. But that I feel like, I know for me as a woman, that's been very helpful. Like I don't have really any pain, but oftentimes with monthly cycles, there could be some discomfort or you could say pain, but really meditating and doing what you're saying and feeling these things that might feel uncomfortable or there's something that's nagging and won't go away, just not labeling it as pain or condemning it or being like, oh, that's always going to be there. Oh, it's just a sensation. And it can shift. I feel like in my own meditation practice, when I've been able to successfully do that, come out of like a lower state, whether it's despair or anger, there's almost like this fear that comes up because it's like, I don't know how to feel something different because I felt that for so long. Mm-hmm. There's almost this fear of not being sick or this fear of being greater, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I would love for you to be able to comment on that if you have anything to say about one, the pain relabeling idea, and then also the fear that can come up with changing your state.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you shared that because, and it's also a reminder for me, and I talk about this with you sometimes and I actually think I said this to you a little bit ago about sometimes, it's beneficial for me to have interactions with people that have not done anything, maybe not even really been that active in their life, because then it reminds me and it gives me more clarity on how to bridge that for them. And so an example, if people I just was doing this with somebody the other day who's not very active and has never really been, a lot of things are painful for them because when you're physically active, I mean, what we think is pain is just it's just a communication. It's just a sensation. I can remember, and this is a perfect example, it's just coming to me now, when I was a kid and I was playing sports, like I said, maybe 5-6 years old, and I'd be running because we'd have to run and, sprint and build up our endurance.
Your anaerobic power. Yeah.
But I remember thinking, this is so painful,
For sure.
But it was just me learning and connecting with my body. Whereas now, if I was to do that same thing, I'd be like, that's just a normal sensation. So
that makes so much sense.
So that's the same thing with any of these things at whatever level. So if I have something that seems like an illness or whatever, it's just a signal from the body. And it is something that I can connect with, and reframing it, like you said, to not be pain or a problem, but, it's a signal that I am being given.
Or even it's not making that signal your identity, like I'm this person with this thing, or I'm this person with this condition.
Yes.
Because yeah, I can understand how someone who isn't really connected with their physical body, how everything outside of you could seem so real. And it might seem like you don't have any control at all over what happens to you or your health.
Yeah.
And you're kind of at the mercy, or you are at the mercy of whatever's outside of you.
Yes.
So how have you worked with that person? How did you bridge that for them?
Here's two things with this, really. I always ask them something that was challenging, or something that was painful, or something that they thought was happening to them physically. So, sometimes it's not always physically. And then I ask them something that they do as even maybe a pleasurable thing. And so then I start to show them how to bridge those as one from the other because of the same experience. Meaning, one seems like it's happening to me because it's something that I'm not familiar with. And the other is something that I intentionally engaged in. But they're the same thing. And so this is kind of what I talk about with yoga. And I think it was in either one or two about how it's getting out ahead of it. So I'm connecting with my body. I'm connecting with it and evolving in it before it needs to, before it has to. So that's what I was saying about like getting out ahead of it physically.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are doing that too, and they engage in activities. Oh, this sounds fun, or I'll do this. And I won't go too deep here, but that's almost like this unconscious path of getting embodied in some way. Where if you're doing yoga, and if people have never done yoga, and I wouldn't have even understood this, and we were just talking about this before, that I just thought yoga was just moving the body and stretching it and getting longer or whatever.
And you know what? Even if that's all it was, that's a great starting point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if that's all anyone ever does, then that's great too.
Yeah, it's a great starting point. I mean, the body and mind, like they're really one thing. They're really one.
Yeah, exactly. And you're constantly expanding it. You're constantly stretching it. You're constantly molding it. You're constantly evolving it. It's this endless evolution. There is no end to it. And so when you're practicing it physically, you're practicing it mentally. They go hand in hand. They're correlated.
Yes, I remember you talked earlier about people being in these intense poses or hard poses, and that's where they really focus. Mm-hmm. And that's not just for yoga. That's for any really challenging activity, whether it's mental or a sport, something physical.
Right.
But yeah, like when I was learning poses that were really like scary, that fear would come up. Mm-hmm. Scary as in like you're going upside down, like you're going to do a headstand. Like that's not a normal movement for the body. Like, And so when I first started doing that, there's this fear. And when I was able to conquer it, I got into that thoughtless state you're talking about in a pose because I was really just focused on balance. Yeah. And then you know what? I would fall when I started thinking about it. Exactly. I would fall and be like, oh my God, am I going to fall? Oh my God.
And then you're creating
and then you know what? I would.
Yes, exactly. And that's the perfect example.
And maybe that answers my own question I had to you a second ago about fear. Because the thoughts might stop and then whatever you're living in comes up. Like if you're this angry person, and I'm not saying that I haven't been angry before, but that comes up and you feel like what your state is. Yeah. And then being able to let go of that. There's sometimes, again, from my experience, this fear of it or of letting it go because you're not sure what's going to happen next or who you are if you're not this sick, angry person or if you're not this whatever person you are. And it's almost like thinking about it just grows the fear or makes you fall.
It's that fear is, like you said, initially on the surface, it's this unknown. It's what is this beyond this? And so if somebody has an identity with anything, it doesn't matter if it's pain or it doesn't matter what the identity is. It's what is beyond that identity. And so that's kind of this initial place of where the fear comes from. Mm-hmm. But when you do these practices in these early stages like that, you are showing yourself beyond that fear. And this is why people, and there's phrases, there's all these truisms like through history of phrases and like, oh, that makes sense of, oh, beyond fear is this. And it's not like, oh, we'll just push through the fear. No, it's go through the fear with intention by breathing through it. And in these early stages, you start to show yourself how to transmute it, not just pushing through it, not just like barreling through it because that's the only way to the other side. No, because then you might not be doing what you should be doing, and you might be pushing through something that you're supposed to learn something from. And if you just push through it, you could cause an injury, or you could have some major repercussions, as opposed to learning what that actually is. And that's different for every single situation, for every single person, every single time. There's no way to say it's this and this is what it is, but there is something to gain from it.
I love that. And it reminds me of us talking about our approaches to yoga versus approaches to other physical activities that maybe aren't as mindful. And I almost want to say like the difference could be not approaching the fear with this, I'm going to wrestle it to the ground.
Yes.
And get through it, but almost approaching the fear with kindness.
Yes.
And confidence, and being like, well, I don't know what's beyond you, but we're just going to approach it and see. And so I fell out of the headstand a lot, but after I fell and I, didn't die, like your brain thinks it's going to happen. I was like, wow, I didn't die. I'll try it. I'll try it again. I'm not going to catastrophize it. Mm-hmm. And eventually the fear went away because, I was able to keep trying and approaching it, but not arrogantly and not stupidly.
But it was also teaching you something. And it was. And what was it teaching you? It was teaching you that when you are present, the fear
was not even real. I just made it up in my own head.
Then when you went into the thought, you weren't present, and then you were creating what you believed outside of that present moment.
I'm aware of it now because of, my mind practices and my thought practices, but I would think, what if I fall? Or I would imagine myself toppling over, because it's almost like you want to prepare for the worst case. Yeah. But it's like you're selecting that in your brain. And then that would happen.
Exactly.
Instead of seeing myself being steady.
Right.
I love that. That really helped me just there.
And I have talked about this with so many people. And it's because it's power. It's kind of this irony that people are trying to control their external worlds, and they don't realize that by relinquishing the external control and finding that connection within, they are actually acquiring way more control than they could even imagine and fathom. And that's a perfect example of it, because when you're present, you're in that flow state. You're unified with your soul, whatever word you want to say. And when you're feeling it and you're connected to it, it's not just you physically doing something and forcing something. You're in flow with this harmonious way with self. And then when you get into your mind and you start thinking, you're then creating those thoughts in the moment. And that's a perfect example of a real-time version of that. And you're like, well, what if I do this? And then it happens. Because you're then thinking that and then creating that. And that works. You can extrapolate that over anything, not just in a physical practice, but in real life. And that's the same thing. Okay, well, I'm fearful of being beyond this version of me. What does that mean? And then you start giving your attention to the fearful aspects and what you want to control. Well, I don't want this to happen, and I don't want this, and I don't want this. And then you create that, as opposed to just lining up with what you know to be true because it feels true in the moment, because you know what it feels like through these practices, either physical or mental. And then you hold that feeling, which is that unification with soul. Then you follow that feeling. Then that's when things manifest from there. But then as you start second guessing it and you're in the mind and you're trying to prepare for the worst, you're creating the worst. And then you prove it to yourself. You're like, see? I knew that was going to happen. Yeah, because you thought you were and you created it.
Of course, right.
And then you think you're so smart because you knew it was going to happen and you proved it to be true.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can convince yourself you're stupid or you're smart and you'll be right in either case, because you'll find evidence. You'll be so stubborn to look and be like, no, look.
Yes.
This is why and this is why. And everyone to each their own.
And then you want to go tell people, like, look, see, I'm so cautious and and this is why, because that happened when I wasn't, and when I was, and I proved it. And then you just create more and more of these thought patterns to prove and give evidence to the things that you think are real. But this is why I always say that it's not the mind and it's the sensation of it. And that's the ego. And we didn't talk about this ever before. And this is why I say there's nothing wrong with the ego. And you did kind of, I think, mention this in either one or two, that the ego is just a perception. It's just a perception. But when you learn that nothing is coming and being created from the ego, that it's just a perception, you learn how to transcend the ego to create and become what you want and still observe through the ego that is constantly evolving. So that is the perception of self. That is the individual perception of self. But when you realize that it's not this stagnant thing, that it's this evolving thing that you are allowing to evolve beyond the ego, then you're just always observing the ego in this joyous way. And you kind of find the humor in it in any given moment. Oh, this is who I am right now because this has allowed myself to be. But some people get caught up in their ego their whole lives. They're like, no, this is who I am. From adolescence, or maybe even at a given time for 10 years or 30 or whatever. And that's why older people, a lot of times, I was just having this conversation yesterday, they become, that's when they say, oh, they're stuck in their ways because they think
but that's just a thought. But that's just a thought.
Exactly.
That doesn't even have to be true.
Which is why that's why when you have those unique older people that are like so themselves, they stand out in such distinct ways. Because they haven't been attached to that, and they do continuously evolve to who they're supposed to be and continuously evolving to be. And they just are so unique that they're like, who is this person? This person's amazing. and it becomes more that way with older people, whereas younger people are still evolving, maybe not so consciously. But this is the whole point of all of it. It is a practice. If you can use these tools to practice all this and be in flow with that constant evolution, because we never stop evolving, then you're always in this joyous flowing state of being. And it's more so about the feeling than it is about the thinking. And you and I talked about this a little bit in 2 or so, where do you have to hold the vision or do you just stay in that place of being? You can do both. But if you only just stayed in that state of being, you would live a joyous life. And then you can use those visualizations when you're in those states of being and you're kind of molding the experience through that. But, that's why you can meet people that seemingly aren't, say, that intelligent, or I've had people like, oh, it's just that person's but they're just happy all the time. You have no idea what they're thinking. You have no idea what they're visualizing or any of that. Maybe they don't speak a lot about their inner worlds, but if they're following their joy, they're following their bliss, they're following their inner source. That's, So yeah, I mean, for me, this whole conversation and about these states this is kind of what I always talk about with the people that I've worked with. I can go even much, much deeper than this with experiences that people can have. But at the surface of it, if you can just find what feels good, then you're following what you should be. But life is going to continuously to move you into that evolved state of being too.
So for working with other people, I think we sort of got into that. If you might speak a little bit about that, if I'm rating them in steps, like not that it's discrete steps, but you were saying, well, do you want me to get into how I work one-on-one with people a little more?
Yeah.
And I am interested in sort of what that would look like if you were working with someone and I guess you're meditating with them or you're teaching them how.
Yeah.
Could you give a more fleshed out example for that?
Yeah. So this is kind of, this is a good example too, because you and I were talking about this earlier. It's all relative to me too, meaning I'm going to attract the people that I want to work with based on how I am being, what is my state of being. And what I was mentioning to you earlier is that I haven't been meditating as much recently, whereas a lot of times I'm doing at least maybe an hour or 2 a day, or maybe 3 or 4. It depends. Or at least maybe 3 or 4 out on once a week or something like that, or at least go into these deeper states. But I haven't been doing that as much recently because of all these things I've been doing in the physical world. And so therefore I'm not attracting those experiences as much. And so the reason I share that is because I can still be whoever I want to be at any given time. Do I want to be this person who's translating for these other people all the time? Or do I just want to be doing these things? And, it's whatever I want to be. And so because I haven't as much, it's not happening right now, but it does as soon as I go there and I ask for it and I literally open it. And this is what I'm kind of prefacing with and why I'm saying this is that in any given moment, we can define and set the intention for what we want to experience. And that experience will come to fruition within, a short period of time. I just wanted to remark on that because I was thinking back in 2, I think it was, that it's always right now. Right now, you define what you want your experience to be. And it's so powerful. It's so powerful. And this goes back to, if you're not able to quiet your mind and you set that intention in that way, you're not going to have that experience because you have to at least get through step 1. And we're kind of creating these linear steps here, and that's okay for right now. But if you can get beyond that and then start setting intentions, those intentions will come to fruition. And I wanted to say this and kind of put that in there because we're talking about these linear progressions of, say, like meditation. And that's when you can be intentional and witness those. And I thought that was important because that allows people to start to see that once they're clear, how much more they have control internally by just setting intentions. And I would throw that in between like 1 and 2, perhaps. Or even part of 2.
Would you say, you mean the intention setting?
Yeah. Because if you set intention, but you really can't clear your mind, you're still just repeating everything and still just
like on top, like trying to smear it on top of all this other stuff.
Yeah. Then you're like looking for that intention and then you're thinking about that intention, but you're still really thinking about these other things and then you're disappointed and you're like, the most important thing is that the difference between clearing the mind and being in that clear state. That is really, I would say, is the one step that can be clearly defined as a step that is, the initial one. And then like 2, 3, 4, whatever is created. Mm-hmm. Those are kind of a little more non-linear perhaps. And that will maybe be defined later on. But I just wanted to say that real quick as a kind of backtrack to some of that. But as far as me, when I'm interacting with people and I'm teaching them in those ways and those deeper ways of being, because I'm there all the time or because I'm there so consistently, it feels like that in my day-to-day life. Like it feels like I'm in this clear space where I'm not thinking thoughts unless I really want to. And I'm observing my life and I'm being so intentional with everything that I do. I know it's almost like this. It's like, okay, I wake up, I get into some breathing practice. I meditate. I'm so clear. Now what do I want? Now I set an intention and I set a broad intention. I want this, this, and this. And it might just be, I want to experience joy. I want to experience love. And I want maybe a little more defined one in some way. So those are my 2 intentions broadly that I want to have experience as I do, say, maybe the more specific intention of, I want to create this or I want to work on this. And so I'm experiencing those as those are occurring. And if I'm in those places or those states of being, then the thoughts that are associated with that start coming to me. And I'm aware of them as I'm observing them and as I'm going about doing these things. And so then if I'm going to work with somebody that same day in these places of being, I'll meditate before I work with them. And a lot of times they just send me messages randomly using like an app like Voxer or something where they just send me like a 20-minute message or a 30-minute message. And it's like, here's what's going on with me. And here's where I'm at right now. And so then I don't have to do it. I don't have to meditate until I'm like going to listen to it, so it's at my time and at my leisure. And so then I'll do it. It may only be like 5 minutes. And I know when I'm there because I can feel it. And so then I feel it and then I listen to the message. And as I listen to the message, I hear the words, but I feel it more than I actually hear the words. And I have my eyes closed and I'm kind of in a meditation. I might be in lotus or some other position that feels conducive to that. And then I immediately start responding. And it's the same thing that I do when I'm meditating and I'm observing. I start speaking and I'm kind of doing the same thing. I'm just observing, but I'm not thinking. I'm not, it's very subtle, but I'm just feeling and then allowing the words to come through me. And this is what I say that people do when they are artists, are even playing sports or whatever. They're doing the same thing. They're not thinking, I need to put a stroke right there and I need to do that there. And it's not like that. They're just feeling it onto the canvas, or they're feeling it through their body into the basket or whatever. And that's the same thing I do when I'm working with people in that way. And so I am able to observe and hear what I'm saying, but I'm not attached to it. I'm not like saying words because it was an experience I had, and now I'm relating it to them. It's, I'm feeling what is being shared with me, and I can feel it in those subtle ways I was talking about 20 minutes ago, like through these energies that I can feel. And now as I'm speaking it, the same energy is now kind of expanding in my body as I say it. So it's like, here's an example. Say I'm listening to the message, I'm in that state, and I can feel energy moving through my physicality like I was talking about earlier. And then as I start speaking, I can feel that same energy moving almost in like the opposite direction through my body. And it's almost like vertical. And I'll start feeling it in the crown of my head a lot, like in the back. And I know when I'm there because it's so clear. Like it's almost like being electrocuted, but not, I mean, it's not painful.
So you're feeling this, and I guess you create meditations or you reply to people who come to you. And then do you ever have a back and forth with them like this, or do they take your content and go? And then what happens to them? Like to them, what kind of outcomes have you seen for people? Like how have their lives changed? Because a lot of what I'm hearing is what you feel, but I'm also interested in how you interact with them and then what happens.
Yeah. So sometimes it's not even an environment where they're coming to ask for me as a teacher and they're asking for questions. Sometimes it's just a random person that I happen to meet, and I can feel that they're asking for something. And
how can I ask how do you know?
So this is perfect. I know that you're asking this. Yeah.
Well, so let's say you're at the grocery store, you're at Whole Foods, because you go to Whole Foods a lot.
Yeah.
Let's say there's someone at Whole Foods and you feel like they're asking for something. How do you know that?
Okay. So I'm going to try to keep this short. This last month, I haven't been in that state because you and I have talked about this. Like, me in particular, what do I want to do? Like, what do I want to be? And is there other ways, for me to create things to facilitate other people finding more of themselves too? Because that's all any of us are ever doing in all of life. We're just creating more through our beingness and showing others how to do the same. It's not about like healing, although it's the same. Healing or expanding, it's all the same. But the reason I have said that is because it does require a lot of focus. If I don't meditate for an hour a day, then it's harder to stay tuned to that. And so it's kind of like maybe a musician, maybe it makes sense if a musician doesn't play for 3 months. Sure, they can still play and they can get back there, but they have to kind of like recalibrate to that, perhaps, maybe a little bit. It's not lost. And this is where there's no way for me to articulate this in a way that's relatable, and I can just do the best that I can, and then people can just try to understand. But when you get to those subtle states, it's so obvious, it's so intense that when you have anyone come into your field, you can feel where they're at relative to it. Like you can feel there is a field around people. There is an energetic field. I mean, science has even proven this and shown this, and you can tune to that and feel that. And so how can I tell when somebody's asking? Well, everyone's always asking. Every single rendezvous is not coincidental. Every single interaction is intentional. Every single one. Because it is an attraction and it's a reflection. It's a projection and reflection of everything that's happening within us. Every single moment of every single day. For sure. For 100% certain. And whether people understand that by listening to this, it's fine, whether they do or they don't. But you can't know that until you've experienced it yourself. But I have experienced it myself with 100% certainty. It's irrefutable. So when I've tuned to that and I can feel that, I'm aware of when this person comes into my field, where they're at. And then if they start to engage with me, then I know it's because they're asking for something, and I can feel it and I can feel where they're at. And so I would start speaking once it felt appropriate. And this is where, when I'm saying it felt appropriate and I did this, to explain the detail of it, I could, but it would take some time. And I'll just maybe do a little bit delving into maybe an example. Say I am at the store. Oh, here, actually, I'll use a real experience. I was walking. And I walk all the time. I walk every morning, every night, every day. Like I just walk a lot. I love to walk in, the neighborhood. And there was somebody who I'd never met before, and they called me over like, oh, hey, but I'd seen him before for months. And I started talking to them and I was like, okay, they're asking for me. I can feel it. I don't know what. I had to talk to him for about 20 minutes before I finally felt it, the opening. And what it feels like is, say I'm talking about that energy and what it feels like in my body. Then when it's the opening is happening, that energy gets faster and it starts moving faster. And it starts moving through my body, like up and down. And I'm like, oh, here it comes. Here's the opening. Here's where it's wanting to come through. Because it's literally just me literally translating or transferring energy. So I know what it feels like. So I know what it feels like from a sensational physical standpoint. So that's where it comes from. It's not me thinking. It's not me going, ooh, this person's saying this. I need to say this. There's no thought. It's just me observing, taking it in, feeling it energetically, and then translating that energy back. And then what happens is, and I'll use this real world example, I start speaking and I'm doing that thing that I talk about. And if I ever do it here on the podcast, you'll notice the difference. I sound different, not significantly like who is this person, but I speak a little more eloquently, a little faster. It's just different. And people have seen it in me. They've noticed it. But what happened in this situation is I start doing that and I start speaking. It just comes from me so fast. And it feels good because when I'm doing it, I'm like a conduit and the energy's flowing through me. It's like to me and through me. And I love it because I'm like, ooh, this feels so good. And I'm just like being this conduit, just observing it and letting it come through and whatever. And it's like being in meditation, but I'm not. I'm actually interacting with people and I'm flowing energy through me to these other people. And so in this particular case, I started doing that. And then I had no idea. I started talking about this woman's specifics. I was like, oh, you're blocked here and you have this with your throat. And I was first speaking to her about a real world situation that she was dealing with. And then I started speaking to her physically about where she was holding on energetically and what she needed to release. And I had no idea. I could have never known this. And as I started speaking it, she started rubbing things and she started doing stuff in her body, almost like she was doing yoga as I'm talking to her. And she started moving her body around. And then finally at the end of it, she was like, I've never had that experience before. And I feel like my whole throat is blocked now and I can talk. And I feel like I haven't been able to talk for like 3 years.
That's amazing.
And what happens is I can feel the energy flowing through me. And then as soon as I get to a place where they can't go any further, the energy is no longer there. And then it's just words. Then it's just like spinning wheels. It's a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
But we can all do that. I'm not unique. We can all do that. It's just, I didn't even know I would have done that. If somebody would have told me that 10 years ago, I thought they were crazy. I just said, what are you talking about? But I mean, if anyone was to spend hours meditating for any duration of time, they're going to connect to these things that are within all of us. And we all have these unique interpretations of it. There's people that can see auric fields. There's all kinds of things that people can do. I can't see things like that. But I've also, when I was doing that year meditation, I was able to see people. I was able to see 2 different versions of them in real time physically. It was like a projection of them and then the real version of them. And I only did that for like a week, but I was also meditating 10 hours a day. The whole point is I realized that there's so much more going on that we can tap into and we're evolving there. We're all evolving there, and it may not be in 5 or 10 or 50 or 100 or 200 years or whatever, but we are evolving to be more in tune to our, say, non-physical or spiritual counterparts or aspects of ourselves, which is way further and much broader, I should say, than anything that we are physically. So yeah, I mean, and most people that I do that with, when I go there, they always talk about how they can feel it in their physical body in some way. When I'm doing it, like, oh, I feel that. I can feel that. I can feel that here. I can feel that here. I can feel that. And it's always about how they can feel it.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's like living meditation, and it's like conversational flow meditation.
Yeah. That's
so,
why I say.
I was just trying to get like a visualization of what these interactions might look like. So that was an example of that. And it sounds like she felt like there was some release for her physically, and she felt like she could speak. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming like the other people that you've worked with, they come back to you and tell you if they've felt something like that, or something has changed for them, or if their situations have gotten better.
Yeah. But what it is too, is that like so it's really what it is just being a conduit for somebody else that they can do themselves anyways. They can do it themselves. I'm just kind of like a window. And this is why I always say that anything outside of us is just a window, whether it be a person, a guru, medicine, plants, anything. It's just a window to a place we're trying to go. But we have to actually go through the door we have to actually bridge those gaps ourselves within.
Yes,
and
not
so,
through the window.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're just always going to be looking at it. And so if I do that for people, in that moment, they are shifted. They are transformed. And so now they've had that resonance. They've had that experience. But then they still have to fully embody it. They still have to do something. They can't.
Right. It's not like they can come and hook up an IV to you and.
Yeah. And people do that. A lot of people do. They'll come back and keep coming back.
Hopefully you say,
of course.
Well, here's how you can do this.
Right. I do. Of course. I always give them the things that they need to do. But this is what happens too. If they do come back and they don't ever transmute or evolve or expand, I can feel it because I no longer have energy flowing through me. So it's like, I don't go there because I'm not receiving anything for them. Like, because then I become a crutch. And if I'm not flowing energy, I'm not going to do it because then I'm depleting myself.
Right. And it doesn't sound, to be honest, that complicated. Really, meditation, the basic elements we've talked about, it's really simple. It's not something that takes like really any training. Like it's just committing yourself to a little bit of time, maybe even in the car, to quiet the mind and really just start feeling inside the body.
Yes.
And just keep doing that, and breath.
Yes.
And even the breath could be that intentional part that you said was so important. And then
the most important.
You feel so connected with other people because you're so connected with yourself, and you've spent all this time doing these basic things, and you've taken it to all these, subtler, more complex levels.
Yes.
But really, for any person, they might not want to do what you do and do that, but being able to not even to meditate for meditation's sake, but to meditate for your own sake, and to start to take control of your everyday experience like that. So who doesn't want to do that? Yes.
Yes. And that's exactly, and that's what you and I talk about, and what we've said in the first one, is that there is no complicated regimen or process or philosophy. It's literally, which is so funny because I've said this to so many people over the last 9 years. It's the breath. It's the breath is literally the foundation. It's the anchor. And people, if I just said you can do anything, just start trying to breathe consciously every day. Just do that. If I only said that, people would just dismiss it because I think that's too silly. That's simple. That's not, that's too simple. But it's not, because if you are to sit with breath for an hour, or even in a pose, if you're doing anything physically, whether it be building tons of muscle, going through yoga poses, going into places in the body you've never been, healing, it's all the breath. You're moving through the breath, which is that anchor. And that's how you get deeper into a pose. If you were to sit into a pose or even do a split or something where you've not been before, you have to breathe into it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And it's the same thing for adding muscle to the body. You have to breathe into the body to add, and I could go into the physiology of it, but I don't need to. Meaning, as you breathe and then you add oxygen to the blood, and then the blood pumps into the muscle, and the glycogen gets into I could go into that, but you don't need to. You don't need to know the details of how it happens. You just need to know what to do to make it happen. And that is just the breath. It's literally that. And so all of these things are anchored in that. So if you're just being conscious of breath day in and day out as much as you can, that will change you, because that's the genesis of consciousness. It really is. But it's so simple. But that's where we think about it. That's where we either relinquish control or we take control. It all starts with that.
It really can be that simple.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can leave listeners with that. Just this idea of starting with breath, even. If, sitting sounds not that fun, or there's not time, like you're breathing all the time.
Yeah.
So maybe for the rest of the day, or whatever their next activity is, as best as they can, keeping their conscious attention on their breathing.
Yeah.
That would be great homework.
Yeah. And
until next time.
And also, because if you're doing that, and I kind of talk about this before, and if you're doing that as you're going throughout your day, you're having to expand your awareness to multiple things, which maybe people will say is multitasking, but it's not. And what I mean is, if you're paying attention to breath as things are happening, and then what you're doing is you're observing what's happening relative to your awareness of breath. Like, oh, I was breathing for that 30 minutes and all that was happening. And then I wasn't breathing and that was, you know what I mean? And they're starting to draw this correlation to their conscious control of breath and their day-to-day experience. Even if they never sit to meditate, even if they don't ever do yoga, then they're at least seeing their conscious awareness of breath and how that correlates to their experience, you know? And that at the very superficial level is really powerful. And then all the things that we've talked about, 1, 2, 3, and, you know, in this one, and then even more stuff that we'll talk about as far as like, you know, creation and manifestation and, you know, attachment and so much other stuff. It's all, you know, that's just other layers beyond this one. But that is at minimum what anyone can do at any given time to take control, you know, and it's why people are like, oh, breathe as you're giving birth or as you're hurt or whatever. Why do people in those moments of real intensity always go to that?
Right. Or to calm down.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. When the people are really angry or they're giving birth or they're injured or they just fell out of something, it's always people intuitively know to go right to the foundation, which is breathe. Yeah. But just do it ahead of time and do it consciously all the time and start taking control. It's just so funny because it's so simple, but people just overlook it, you know?
Or overthink it.
Yeah.
Or it can't be that simple.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it's got to be flashier. Can't it be flashier?
But what's so funny
flashy
is
poses and Lululemon and.
But what's so
where's
funny?
Where's the Lululemon for my lungs? We have to market something like that.
Yeah,
Lululemon inhalers. Just kidding.
Something to breathe. Some breathe apparatus. But you know, that's the kind of paradox. It's just so funny because it is super simple. But that simplicity and that anchor takes you to the expansiveness that most people would be like, oh, that's crazy. Or that's woo-woo. I never use that term ever, but still. But that's what's so funny. That simplicity takes you to those depths, you know, like beyond what most people, experience or even fathom.
Yes. And it connects us all together.
Yeah.
Every person is breathing right now. Every person.
I'm not.
Everyone. No. Well, I think that maybe next time we should do your 3-minute meditation.
Yeah.
I think that would be really fun to give people something practical to put these, to actually put these things into practice in a short, digestible way that, you know, it's easy.
Yeah. The way I envisioned it was just starting like making that kind of maybe the intro to each one. And then people are just, you know, people are aware each time they listen to it. Oh, I'm going to do that with it real quick, you know?
Sure. Yeah. I love that idea.
So, yeah. Well, awesome. This has been so fun. I feel like we went all around. I kind of wanted to ask you some questions, but we'll do that next time. I want to ask you some questions more so about, you know, some of your experiences, because you've shared a lot with me in some of your practice, meditation in particular is what I'm referring to, that I would love to ask you about. And we've talked about it before, but I think in maybe this format, there might be more to explore because you've shared some pretty amazing things with me. And that's the thing. We all have different unique experiences in these deeper states. But there is, you know, these consistent experiences, but we all have our unique kind of offering from them, our unique perspective of what we share. And I will say this, that if people were doing this, everyone's unique, whether it be the physical practice or the mental practice, that we all have something to share that is profound. And everyone's body expresses differently and everyone's mind. And it's all part of this big web of consciousness that we're all a part of. And every single person has something amazing to share. And these practices allow us to practice it, hone in on it, tune into it, and then express it. So every single person that's listening to this has something amazing. And there's no better tools that I've ever experienced in everything that I've ever done. That is what yoga and meditation is. In these simple ways.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
So awesome. Well, thank you again, Odette. As I always say, you're amazing. Perfect companion. I appreciate you so much. And thank you everyone for listening. And if you have questions, we do have an email. I have gotten some emails. The main suggestion is that we have an intro, which we did now. But if you have any other questions about any things that we talk about, certainly send an email. And I think it'd be fun to maybe read some of those and answer those. So, yeah.
I would love that. Let's totally do that.
Awesome. Thank you again, everybody. Talk to you soon.
I welcome joy. I welcome harmony. I welcome all of the beautiful things that are meant for me. I welcome light. Let it surround me. Grounded and rooted in the earth, we align with the